Hi, welcome to the second conversation in a several-part series. We'll see how many it is, with the title of Decentralized Spirituality. So the first conversation, we are exploring a comparison of the way decentralization is happening in technology with blockchain, which some of us may be more familiar with some of the forms of that in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. And then we're also looking at what if there's a similar trend happening in spirituality of decentralization from religious and spiritual institutions to the individual person being the center point of the sacred or the divine. For the second conversation, the title I'm playing with is Decentralized Spirituality from Exoteric to Esoteric. So I wanted to touch on something connected to the last conversation. It might be easy to create a duality, a dualistic way of thinking in exploring how the sacred could be situated in either an institution or in a person. We might get the idea that institutions are bad and that the evolution is to move the centering of the sacred to each individual. And that would be the positive shift. And of course, the duality in that, the opposition, the binary in that could be that, now we're just going from saying, well, the institutions were good, but now it's the person that's good. The person is good, the institutions are bad. And, you know, in the life we live, there's much complexity and nuance. So while it can be helpful to create, let's say, a working duality, in this conversation, I wanted to get into some more nuance around that. That's where this title comes from, referring to the exoteric and the esoteric. So that's some intellectual framing. So why don't we again take a pause for a moment just to allow ourselves to arrive where we are. So for you, that might just be taking a breath, taking a pause. Maybe drinking a sip of tea as I'm doing, pouring some tea from a pot into a cup. You know, as we have this conversation about the sacred and exploring how we ourselves might be the very ground of the sacred itself. I really wanted to voice and name that aspect or lived quality of the sacred, because this conversation is an exploration, you could say a conceptual exploration, and wherever that exploration takes us, we can hold all the while that what we're simply exploring is this truth that's already here with us. That you and me, that all of us are expressions or revelations of the sacred or the divine. So let's look at these words. Let's start with the word esoteric. You know, the way I customarily have thought of that word is pretty much along the lines of a standard dictionary definition. So I'll spell that word out, E-S-O-T-E-R-I-C. And dictionary definition is along the lines of some kind of like secret teaching or understanding that is passed down or communicated. And it has these connotations of maybe secret societies or, you know, kind of hidden or mysterious forms of initiation into different spiritual or religious teachings or understandings. And, you know, that's not something I have a particular personal interest in or resonance with. I guess I've always felt that what's most interesting to me is what we share in common and how we can find mutual understanding and have things be open and shared and transparent rather than, let's say, kept for a select few. So I always thought of the word esoteric in that way. And I'm going to introduce a person now who is very dear to my heart. And that person is known as Ibn Arabi. And there's a lot one could say about Ibn Arabi. And I'll try and keep it simple by way of metaphor. For me personally, this is the way I look at it, just as perhaps one could not explore the history of literature without talking about Shakespeare, or one could not explore the history of physics without talking about Einstein. For me, once you've learned about Ibn Arabi, once I learned about Ibn Arabi, it's hard for me to think of the legacy of humanity's spiritual history without thinking of his genius. And Ibn Arabi was born in the 11th century in Spain, in Andalusia, and lived for around 75 years of age. He's considered perhaps the greatest Muslim, the greatest Sufi teacher that there has been. it's been amazing for me to discover him, because I've heard about, let's say, some famous Sufi poets like Rumi or Hafez, but I only just learned about Ibn Arabi, and it's like learning of an Einstein or a Shakespeare when previously you'd been ignorant about that. So maybe that's all I'll say about Ibn Arabi for now, but I will share his perspective on the esoteric and also the exoteric, because he breaks it down very simply, and it was clarifying for me. He says the exoteric, when it comes to spirituality and religion, is simply the external practices. So that this word exoteric, with that root of exo, E-X-O, it refers to the outside. So we can think of the exoteric as these institutions that we mentioned in the last conversation, spiritual religious organizations, the ways we might practice and connect within those institutions, within those communities. And Ibn Arabi says those are our exoteric practices. That's how we engage in the outer forms of spirituality and religion. Ibn Arabi also says the complementary aspect to the exoteric is the esoteric. And the root ESO of the word esoteric simply means within. These are our inner practices. This is our inner connection to the divine, the sacred, or the way that the sacred and the divine is in its nature, in our nature, literally within us. You could say embedded within us, or we are embedded in it. There's an inseparability, it's our native state, so to speak, of being. This esoteric dimension of our spiritual or religious being. And I believe Ibn Arabi used the metaphor of, as humans, we have two eyes. Whether or not he used that metaphor, I will use it. And you could think of the way we see clearly is to have these two eyes in harmony, or in balance. So just using this metaphor of balance, Ibn Arabi says we can have both our exoteric practices and affiliations, and we can also have our esoteric, our internal orientation to the divine. So, for example, I might go to a meditation class and listen to a teacher and learn from them, or a church. And at the same time, I want to recognize and to honor that even though I may receive much guidance from these exoteric forms or people or institutions, that I don't want to lose touch with this esoteric dimension, that the sacred is also simultaneously within me. And that maybe it helps through this perspective. It's kind of clear that the reason when I am doing an exoteric practice or engagement, the reason why I might learn something from someone else's connection to the divine is because the sacred is already within me. It's like recognizing like. So just pause for a moment to digest that exploration. Perhaps have a sip of tea. One of my mentors, Dr. Dan Siegel, he often talks about this concept of integration, that with integration, we're integrating the differentiated parts. So if we think of ourselves as being integrated with the exoteric and the esoteric, we're integrating both of these aspects of ourselves. We learn from others, and we also learn from the wholeness that's already part of who we are. And the goodness, you could say. You could say the love that is part of the nature of our being. So returning to this metaphor of technology, just as there is a movement of decentralization in technology, let's say a new wave emerging that is based in the blockchain, that is based in decentralized organizations, decentralized finance, decentralized communities, governance. I imagine that the centralized institutions aren't suddenly going to disappear. There's going to be a coexistence. There will be the centralized continuing and the emergence of the decentralized to find a balance. And ideally, both of these forms, the central and the decentral, are supporting the health, wellness, the well-being, the freedom, and the empowerment of the humans that are engaging with those systems. And the same principle would apply in decentralized spirituality. This movement of decentralization, it's clearly happening. We see polls showing that in the United States, the millennial generation or Generation Z, there is a deep disaffiliation, a disidentification with religious institutions. People certainly may be identifying as spiritual, but they are not necessarily identifying as religious. There's a steep drop in that identification. It's quite remarkable. So in order to stay in balance with those trends, with the emerging generations, it does seem that a form of decentralized spirituality is going to be really important, because for people to find purpose and meaning and a sense of belonging in life, in the universe, in existence, to be able to find that sense of the sacred, to recognize the divine internally, especially when there's a movement away from external forms of religion and spirituality, to be able to find that sanctuary, that resource within, is going to be really important. So, as I mentioned in that last conversation, the education in that esoteric spirituality, the validation, the honoring of each person's access to the sacred as their birthright. The orienting to that is going to be really important in a world that we could say might be losing its bearings, its orientation to the sacred in the secularization that is naturally happening in modernity or post-modernity, in this movement away from faith and belief in institutions. That can leave us unmoored. This has been something that's been happening in the modern world in the way that Nietzsche proclaimed in observation of this movement that God is dead. That was his metaphor to recognize this lack of or loss of faith in what we classically thought of as God. God maybe as this external being who commands or bears authority over us. So this has been happening in Western societies for, you could say, 100 or more years. But this is also happening around the world in societies that are modernizing for more traditional cultural orientations. Let's say in Islamic cultures, for example, in a talk that I was listening to by an academic from the Ibn Arabi Society, he was talking about this trend that has been happening in the West, but that is also now happening in societies that are modernizing around the world. He was proposing that Ibn Arabi offers us a wisdom to orient to this esoteric dimension of being. So perhaps in the next conversation, we'll explore a little more about what does this decentralized spirituality look like, this spirituality where we can find the divine as part of our being. For this conversation, I really wanted to bring in, let's say, a sense of balance or perspective, or you could say medicine to the way we might take that first conversation and create a duality, the institution versus the personal. We, the goal here is really to create deep sense of freedom and possibility and choice and agency. So we really want to honor each person's way of connecting to the exoteric. For you, it might be in a very traditional or orthodox religious practice or community. It might be, you might be an atheist or an agnostic. That is the way you are orienting to the exoteric dimension in how you're seeing society. Perhaps for you, the exoteric is very secular. You don't have an engagement with religious or spiritual institutions. But whether you are an orthodox practitioner or whether you are even an atheist, I want to perhaps make a bold statement or a bold invitation that however you identify in the exoteric, that the sacred, the divine, whatever our beliefs, is fundamentally woven into our being. And that might be challenging for someone who identifies as, let's say, an atheist. And it may well simply be because those words, the sacred or the divine, do not resonate. So it might be other words like the cosmos, the universe, the mystery of life, perhaps it's the science in quantum physics that points to multiple dimensions or multiple universes. Something that is larger than simply the three-dimensional human orientation that we are, let's say, wired to perceive the universe through. We can recognize that even if we have a thoroughly scientific, exoteric outlook, we can also recognize that as humans, we only perceive things through a very narrow dimension of the electromagnetic spectrum biologically, and that there is an existence that is so much larger than what we perceive. So as we conclude this conversation, let's conclude it exactly where we are as we take this verbal intellectual exploration and just come back to our bodies, to the breath, to right here and right now. If everyone watching this video was in a room together, right here and right now, in a circle, being with each other, seeing each other, aware of the sensations in our body, aware of the breath flowing, we would be part of this being together and this knowing of this being together. That is just very simple, real, present, recognizable, shared. Feel it, can sense it, can relax into it. Just pausing and letting the experience of this moment, this being, be what we're in touch with, what's in touch with us. So thank you, my friends. Thanks for joining me in this conversation. And if you'd like to check out some more of my explorations around these themes, you can visit the website allykind.com, ALLYKIND. Details in the description. And you can subscribe to get notifications of when I do new posts and post new videos like this. Thank you for being you, and I hope to see you again.